Let's continue here. What is the most basic test that we can write for our web application? Well, that's initially to make sure that our application renders, right? To that, make sure that it comes up and it's even visible. And so for that, we're going to use an end-to-end testing tool known as Cypress. Probably a lot of you are familiar with it. This is according to Cypress. They're fast and easy, reliable testing for anything that runs in a browser. So let's get started with Cypress. What you need to do in your Visual Studio Code is you're going to, of course, navigate to that directory that I was talking about, and you're going to run npx cypress open. So let's do that together. So you have to keep your server running here, okay? The server is for our web application. If we stop the server, the application is not going to be up any longer. And so you can add another terminal here in VS Code and then make sure that you're in the right directory. So cd testing for charity, and then you want to be in my React app, okay? And then you do npx cypress open. Here is the initial Cypress UI. What you can see here is we have two spec files that it's showing us. We are going to be working in every single module. We are working in an exercise file. It's literally going to be named exercise. That's where we're going to do our exercise. We're going to write code. And then if for some reason you're not able to figure out why stuff is not working, if you go to solution, you will be able to see how to make that happen, and it should work for you. And so, for example, if we come here and click run the two integration specs, you will see our Cypress tests execute. So we're going to ignore the exercise part because it doesn't have anything, right? You can see we have a few tests in here that we're going to work on together. But for example, our application loads, there's no commands here, and there's no commands here. In our solution, there are some tests. The really cool thing about Cypress is that you have the test runner here on the left-hand side with the tests, and then you also have the application running on the right-hand side. It's literally showing us our application here, and we can interact with this application just like normal. So for example, if you want to inspect this URL here, you can just come and start inspecting it because it's just running in a browser. So you can see all the information about this URL. There's even a handy little selector playground from Cypress. So what if you want to identify this image, for example? You can see Cypress even shows you the command to perform if you want to perform an operation. So if you wanted to interact with the link, you would use cypress.get, and then it's passing in, you can see a class name here, and then you can copy this to the clipboard and use it in your code. Which brings me to an excellent question. Where does the code actually live? So whenever you install Cypress, the code for Cypress and all other important information lives in a Cypress folder. So you can see inside of my React app, there's a Cypress folder. It has a bunch of folders here that are not so important. What's more important is actually this integration folder. That's where our tests go. And so, for example, if we come to this exercise.spec file, you'll see that here we have some preloaded code that we're going to use to do our exercises. And so whenever you write code in here and you save this file, you'll see that Cypress will automatically run your tests in its little, I guess you can call it, runner. Okay, so with all of that said, let's proceed. That's kind of a little overview about Cypress. Let me hide too many windows. So now that you kind of understand a little bit about Cypress, now it's time for an exercise. The goal is for you to write a Cypress test to make sure that our application opens. So as I already showed you, you'll open up that exercise spec file and then simply follow the instructions in the it loads test. So that's here. You can see we have an it loads test, and you'll simply follow the instructions. You can see where to put your code and follow the commands in order to make it happen. And hopefully it'll work out for all of you. You'll use the cypress.visit command to navigate to the application URL. And then you use the cypress.get command to get an element. And then you perform an assertion using a should. And then you'll see that Cypress, because of this up here, will provide us IntelliSense that'll give us all the capabilities that are available for our assertion. It's up to you how, of course, you want to assert it, but the recommendation is here. I'll give you all a moment to finish that up. When you're done with this first test, save your file, and then it will automatically run here in exercise. It loads. You should actually now have some test code that executes. So if you wanted to do some code, you simply would come here, right, to start using Sci. You can see that the IDE provides us this capability. Again, that comes from putting this at the top of the file, which I personally really like about Cypress is this IDE. You know a lot of Node and JavaScript stuff doesn't always provide an IDE, and then you'll use the visit command, right? Don't need anything there. So that's that. And then if you wanted to get an element, use the get command, right? You can see now IntelliSense provides, hey, give me a selector. So the selector, right now it's identifying by app link. You saw how you can use the selector playground to figure it out. Another way to do it, which is why using kind of JavaScript with our front end JavaScript application is really awesome, is we have access to the source code of the application. So the source code of the application lives in a bunch of places. Because this is such a simple application, but still has a lot of testing, you can see in app.js, this is where the main logic lives. This is kind of the entry point of React applications. And so what you'll see here is, here's our link, right? Our A attribute. And you can see a bunch of details about it. So you can identify it however you want. I would say the best locator in this case is class name, but we'll talk about that later and how to make that even better. That was all, by the way, created automatically by create React app. And then you can do should. And then when you open close quotes, you can see we get an IntelliSense of a bunch of different conditions. You can just do, kind of just think like, what do you want it to do? So we want it to be visible. And there it is, it exists. Wonderful. And we save it. So when we save it, it's going to run here in Cypress. Yeah, again, let me just quickly mention this. Everybody should be working. All our work for this entire workshop is done out of this folder here. Testing for charity. Think of it as a totally separate repo. Don't worry about anything else in here. This is a totally separate repo. Testing for charity, my React app. This is all the code is literally in here, okay? So you navigate to testing for charity, my React app, and then you run npx Cypress open. Cool. And so let's take a look at our loads test. You can see that now there are some commands in this exercise, okay? You can see there's a visit command. It shows that it visited the URL. It shows you that it got the app link. You can see how it highlights it. And then it performed an assertion, which was successful, that the app link was visible. If you're getting lost, all the documentation is here for end-to-end tests. Yeah, thank you, Josh. I'll continue here. Another cool little trick that we can do, since we're working on exercises with Cypress, is you can actually just focus on a test. See how we have a bunch of tests here right now, and not all of them are important, right? Like this, you kind of don't want to see. You can focus on a single test by doing it.only, and then only a single test shows up in the UI. And that's the only test that's going to be executing while you're updating the file. So it's kind of helpful to focus in on the test. Okay, cool. Let's proceed, friends. I think there's enough time for people. So, quick question for you all. What does this test validate? Like, what is it checking in terms of the system? What kind of connections is it checking? This it loads test that we just did. Page opens and link exists and is visible. Yup, totally agree with that, Justin. The app is loaded in the DOM. Yeah, totally agree with Justin and John. That's exactly what it's validating. And if we want to kind of get a little bit more technical into the definition of end-to-end, what it's basically doing is checking the DOM to database connection, right? So it's checking that the UI of the application is connected to the backend of the application. And so that's how it's able to spin up, right? There's the server that's running, and then we have the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that are getting rendered. So it's testing that, technically it's testing that connection. So let's look at our test coverage now. What we just did. So now we just achieved this test, right? So let's update this. So our application now renders. What type of test did we just use to achieve this? UI, yeah, UI is a good way to say it. Yeah, UI, also known as end-to-end test. Some people refer to that. It's also technically a functional test. So it's all the same thing. UI, end-to-end, functional, yep. And we used it using Cypress. Cool. Let me make sure I didn't mess anything up. Looks good. All right, awesome. We're making progress on our testing journey. That's an interesting question, Paul. It is validating responses, that's for sure, right? I wouldn't say it's an API test though, because an API test, you want to be hitting an endpoint and getting back a response. And so in that case, what we would want is probably to hit localhost and wait for a 200 response, right? That's how I would identify a API test. So right, whenever we reload this, right, you can see here's a bunch of different calls, but this is the one that I would be checking for status 200 from this document. So yes, that's a wonderful point that this end-to-end test is validating this. That's one of the good things about end-to-end tests. They validate a bunch of stuff at the same time, but I would want to separate. If I wanted to check for responses, I would want to separate my API test into a separate test. Hopefully that makes sense, Paul. Cool, let's move on. So, okay, next test. How would we ensure that the link is correct? And our link, based on the requirement, should be going to ultimateqa.com. Validate that when the link is clicked, it goes to the correct URL. Okay, cool. Cypress might be looking at some configure base URL variable. Click link, check. Cool. Where's the test plan? Okay, cool. Yeah, you all are awesome. Thank you. Yeah, use location to check the path. Cool. Yeah, a lot of you have said the very typical answer of clicking the link, make sure it goes to the correct URL. Awesome. So we're all going to learn something today. For everybody, for Pradeep, who was asking about the test plan is all throughout our documentation, Pradeep. Everywhere you'll see test coverage, there's going to be links to the same test coverage. And if you just want the file itself, it lives in the testing for charity, my React app docs, test coverage.md. It will keep referencing this report throughout the entire presentation. Cool. So you all said exactly kind of the typical thing that happens, which is an end-to-end test to validate that a link works. So right, for example, with Cypress, the way you do visit, get the link, click it, and then you ensure that the URL will contain whatever you want it to contain, right? Typical test. The problem with this test, there are a few. So I'll scroll up here so that we can see better. First, number one, actually, we never need to click on links to ensure that they're working, because the clickability of a link is a browser's native behavior. And so we obviously don't need to test the browser's native behavior because the browser vendors did that for us. And so instead, there are other techniques that we can use to ensure that a URL is correct. And so I'm glad we got all of those answers, because it's typically what everybody does is clicking the URL, but not only is that unnecessary, it's also inefficient. And then here I also mentioned that you should never need to test that a link opens in a new tab either. And we're going to talk about that as well, about why clicking and going to a new tab is actually unnecessary, because that's also a native browser behavior. So we're going to write a test together to ensure that the link goes to the correct location. So again, you're going to go stay in that same exercise, that spec, and then you're going to implement the link goes to ultimateqa.com. So yeah, just scroll down a little bit. If you want, you can do it.only. And in your Cypress, focus only on this test, or you can run all of it. It's up to you. And then you'll implement the code. And what you will see as you implement that code is that ultimately we really just care about the href attribute of our application, which if we look at it here, we really just care about this href attribute. Again, as I said, the clickability, if the clickability of this link is broken because it's an A tag, it's going to be broken for the entire internet. So we don't need to test it. It's not necessary. You just want to check that the href attribute matches what you want it to match. So yeah, feel free to take a moment, maybe take like 5 minutes, implement the test.
Nikolai, there is a question in the Q&A. How do I bring the left panel on the site running locally? Also, how do I know the tests are running?
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, let me make sure everyone is on the same page here, okay? Just again, our entire workshop from start to finish, we're working out of this testing for charity folder in my React app folder, okay? So we need 2 things to run Cypress tests. Number 1, we need the actual web application running. So I'm going to kill my web application here. If we come back here and I refresh, you'll see it's dead. So the very first thing you want to, of course, navigate to this My React Apps, testing for charity, My React App directory. And then you're going to do npm start. This will start the server for the React application. Give it a moment, you'll see it, boom, there it is. This is not it, but if I refresh here, there's our application running again, okay? Next, keeping the same exact terminal open, we want to keep the server running. You want to open a new terminal. If you're using VS Code, you just click this plus symbol, it'll open up a new terminal. I have that running here. I'm going to kill Cypress for a second using Control-C. Control-C kills the server. Again, from the same exact directory, we're going to do npx Cypress open. It's going to open up Cypress there. This is the first window that comes up. It shows you all of the files that you have in the integration tests folder right here. And since we are working on exercise spec, this is the one that we want. So this is the one I'm going to click on. And it's just going to run it like this. And so now with Cypress, you're going to have 2 windows that are there. Use this one, which is no longer really necessary. And this is the one that we're really interested in to work at. And so that's how it looks. So let's do this together and see if that helps anyone. Okay, let's do it together. We're going to proceed here. Okay, so same as before. Just copy the URL. Oh, by the way, we should talk about where does this URL come from? If you go to Cypress, and it's in support, in index.js. No, I forget where I put it. Is it in this integration? Where did I put my? Oh,
Unknown caller.
oh, it's here. It's my Cypress JSON. That's where the base URL is. Where did it go? That's how you define it. That's why we don't need anything in here. And so then you just do sci.get. You all should already know how to get our element, which what was it? It was like app link, app dash link. Then we do a should. Oh. And then what should it have? It should have an attribute, right, which is href. And that attribute should include, what should it include? Our part of our URL. So if we run it, here's our test. You can see visits, gets that link, and then does 2 assertions. What if we don't check that and check like Google? You'll see there's an automatic wait for about 4 seconds from Cypress, and this is what a failure looks like, right? It expected ultimate QA to include google.com. And of course, it doesn't, but then it kind of shows you even where in your code, in our exercise spec.js, where in the code that error occurred. So that's kind of what an error state looks like. Let me get back. Wonderful. Let's move on. Cool. Let's update our test coverage. We validated that the link is correct. We did that with this type of test. And we use Cypress for that. Wonderful. Let's make sure I didn't break anything. Looks great. Cool. Let's move on here. Then there's another common test that happens whenever we click a link, and that's ensuring that a link opens in a new tab, right? So if you notice in our application, the link opens in a new tab. So I've seen individuals testing for this. I don't think it's so important to test for it. Like I wouldn't waste any, if much of my time on such a test. However, if you are performing this test and it is deemed that your application needs this requirement and it's priority and you want to take time to write a test for it, the most efficient way to do it is not even to click on a link. You can just check an attribute of the link. That attribute is this target attribute. Whenever the target attribute is blank, it opens up in a new tab. Whenever the target attribute is not there, like now, you can see I updated HTML, it'll open up in the same link, in the same tab. So that's all you need. Again, clicking it unnecessary because that's just native behavior of a browser and HTML. And all we have to do is just ensure that the target attribute contains the blank there. So with that said, I think you should have, you have an exercise now to try on your own to implement the test that it should open link in new tab. So again, just going back to the same exact exercise spec and then implementing the test to ensure that there's a certain attribute present and includes a certain value. Let's update our test coverage really quickly. So now we know that our link opens in a new tab. Again, to be honest, I put that in there only because I've seen individuals testing tabs, clicking on links and ensuring that a new tab is open. So I just wanted to share a more efficient way of doing it. I personally would never test a web application to make sure that it opens in a new tab, unless, I don't know, there's some critical business need behind it. Cool. So we've made good progress, right? But one thing I kind of wanted to show here is that even though it's a small application, right? It's literally one page, an image, and a link and some text. There's a good amount of testing to do, and so you can obviously imagine as we scale out to bigger applications with more functionality and pages, it becomes that much more complicated. So there are disadvantages of functional UI, aka end-to-end tests. The disadvantages are that we do need a browser and we need a server, right? You saw that in order to run the test, we have to do npm start and start up our application, which is an entirely built application. And it's quick because it's local host, but what happens now when you need to deploy it and you want to test on a QA environment? Now you need to start figuring out how do you deploy the application? What is the URL of that deployment environment? How do I hit that URL? And then you start getting into network issues because you want to test the QA environment instead of a local host, right? So then your test becomes slower. Right now, our tests are super fast again because they're local hosts, but will become slower once network is introduced. And we do need to learn an extra dependency API for Cypress. Now, if, for example, we know that we're going to have end-to-end tests in our suite, learning Cypress may be mandatory regardless. But if we can achieve the same thing with other ways, such as component or unit tests, maybe we don't even need to learn Cypress. And so that's something that could be avoided and not add extra work to our already busy testing plates. So that was kind of my point. Can we do the same thing more efficiently? Yes, we can. Keep that in mind. We're going to get to it towards the end of the session of how we accomplish the same things, but in a more efficient manner. And so here's a little summary of everything we've done so far. Basically, how we used end-to-end Cypress tests to do functional testing of the web application. It seems efficient on localhost, which I would totally use it on localhost. But as we kind of scale this out and make it more realistic, there are a lot of drawbacks to end-to-end testing, and that's why we want to use other means to test this functionality.